There's been a lot of discussion in the last few weeks about My Big Fat Gypsy Wedding, the television show on Channel 4, I think, which has, well, I suppose, exposed in a very over-the-top way, you might argue, some of the practices by travellers in the UK. I've only seen one episode, but our producer Sinéad Hubble has been glued to the series. What have you made of it so far, Sinéad?
I find it very interesting to watch because it does show the kind of culture that a lot of the women that they do speak to in it, you can kind of see why they go to extremes for their wedding day. At first,
it just focuses on the weddings, is it, or some of the customs around the wedding?
It's kind of developed now over the last couple of weeks. It did start off with the weddings. It looks at communions. Last night showed a christening. It showed the bare knuckle fighting last night. So it's kind of now examining all the aspects of traveller life.
Okay, well, if you take weddings then as the first example, what is so over the top that has captured so much attention?
Everything about the wedding. Everything. Down from the dress to the bridesmaids to how they arrive, how the men arrive at the church. Last night it showed a wedding of a 21-year-old man, Johnny, marrying a 22-year-old Violet Ann, and they had an owl bring the wedding rings from the end of the aisle up to them. He arrived by helicopter. They had an LED dance floor. They had, everything was to the extreme. Like her dress wasn't as big as previous dresses we've seen on the show, but it was still fairly big. But it does, especially the dresses for the women, it's to the extreme. The cakes as well.
Leaving the material things to one side then, what about the culture and the practices? Last week was the episode I managed to capture a few minutes of, and there was a practice known as grabbing, which to some people would seem quite primitive and quite violent. This is where the woman is essentially grabbed by the man and, well, you can fill in the blanks after that.
Yeah, it does seem to be a bit of extreme. Like there was one where it showed a 15-year-old female. She was actually pushed up against the wall, pinned to the wall by one of the young lads. And she said, it wasn't as violent as previous occasions that it's happened to her, and it's not very nice at all, but you just have to get on and live with it.
Now the question is this an editorial position taken by a tabloid television programme, or does it accurately portray what happens? And we'll get to that in one moment with David Joyce of the Tullamore Travellers Movement. Last night's episode, though, was particularly violent because it looked at, as you said, the bare-knuckle fist fighting.
It did. Now, it didn't show too much of it, and there was only the one fight within it, but it was pretty gruesome. The women are not allowed to attend there. So again, it kind of shows the other aspect of it, that the men are the ones in it that are the dominant figures, that the women, when you first look at it, you're kind of like, oh, these women are going to extremes. But it kind of shows that they have one day in their life that's about them. Before they're married, they're their father's property. After they're married, they're their husband's property. Like the groom last night said that he owns his wife now, even though she had been independent, working for the last 5 years. She was giving up her job. It kind of back in the old days when women didn't work after they were married, it was that extreme because they now have a role where they have to look after the man, they have to look after the home. So it shows different cultures, but the violence in it last night was tough to watch because it was two young guys just beating each other up, and then they walked away.
Which isn't confined to the UK, of course. It has happened here in Ireland. We covered it on the programme before.
The interesting thing is that they refer to them as Irish travellers the entire time within the thing, or they never speak of them as being from the UK, that they always refer back to them. And even though they mightn't have an Irish accent, they might have been living in the UK for a long, long time, they always refer back to them as the Irish travellers.
OK, Sinead, stay with us for a moment. We have David Joyce, who's coordinator of the Tullamore Travellers Movement. David, you're very welcome to the programme.
Good morning, Will.
To what extent would this be an accurate portrayal of these different customs, from weddings to baptisms, christenings, and all the way up to this bare-knuckle fist fighting?
Well, I don't think it's an accurate portrayal in any real sense. I mean, I think what the programmes have been showing over the last number of weeks, they've certainly shown, I suppose, the individual tastes and choices made by individual families in respect of their particular celebration, whether it be a wedding or a christening function. I suppose what it demonstrates perhaps is accurately is perhaps for Irish travellers and many Irish travellers who live in Britain is perhaps the religious bit to begin with in terms of Catholicism and that particular practice and belief that's there. But for how people will celebrate those particular occasions in one's life, I mean, there's as much diversity among the travelling community as there is among the non-traveller community.
So where would you find fault with the portrayal then?
Well, it's not so much as fault. I suppose it's. I think you used the words yourself. I mean, I think what Channel 4 have done with this programme, there's been a lot of editorial decisions made. There's been a lot of, I would say, fairly manipulative editing done within the programme, which is a sad reflection on Channel 4 as a programme maker, which has over the years produced very good and very, very accurate and very, I suppose, sincere documentaries. And my problem with this particular programme is that it has presented as a documentary on the lives of travellers, when in reality what we're watching is some sort of glorified piece of reality, trashy television, something that has become common in television stations over the last sort of 10 to 15 years. And within the traveller community, there are people, with taste and sometimes with sort of more money than sense, that sort of will fall into that category. And you watch some of these sort of programs. It isn't just the traveller community; they can be presented in this way. MTV have been producing classic sort of programs over the last number of years around similar type of over-the-top focus on material presentation at weddings or celebrations. I think My Sweet 16 is a classic example of that type of program.
So if we leave the materialism out of the equation and focus away from the big cakes and the over-the-top dresses and so on, the customs that it alludes to, the possession of women by men, is that how traveller men view their wives? No,
I think, as I said, the traveller community is as diverse at this stage as any other community in Ireland or anywhere else. And whilst there's certainly, I suppose, individuals and people within that community who still have whole traditional type views and will see perhaps clearly defined gender roles, there is as much of the opposite of that among the traveller community as there is anywhere else. Unfortunately, that doesn't make good television, and the notion that you can present a man who will openly say on television that I own this particular woman or this particular person, makes better television, it makes a better reaction. And I think that's, as I said, that's the point I make about the type of editing and the type of manipulation perhaps that has gone on in this particular show. But no, it doesn't reflect. But
could you give us an idea as to what extent that view would be held, the one that was conveyed on the television?
Well, it's certainly held, and whether it's held as, I don't think it's held, and I honestly don't think it's held anymore. It's no more persuasive among the travelling community than it is among the settled population. I mean, there's clearly attitudes and sexist attitudes that exist among the settled population and towards the role of men and women, and they exist among the travelling community, I would say, in like proportion. There are many traveller women who are active within their communities, active as spokespersons and as leaders within that community, and would question how that particular programme has portrayed traveller women particularly, and I think also how it has portrayed traveller men. I don't think that type of notion of the dominant male over and their ownership of women is as prevalent as that programme would try and present. Okay,
well, let's come at it from a different perspective then. If you were a programme maker and you were trying to depict what you consider to be an accurate reflection of traveller lives, what would the narrative be like?
Well, I think the actual programme does hit on a number of important points and a number of important, I suppose, issues within the traveller community. And I think, as slightly alluded to there, there's certainly on some of the programmes the notion of, I suppose, travellers and where they live and travellers facing eviction was touched on by the programme, and in a very shallow sort of way. And then the focus immediately goes back to the flouncy dresses and the frocks. So there are a number of issues that within the show that are, I think, worthy of examination, worthy of I suppose, a better presentation. You mentioned, and it's just been mentioned that one of the issues that's caused a lot of debate among the travelling community, and certainly among the traveller and gypsy community in Britain, is this presentation of grabbing, which you described there as young men grabbing young women.
Yeah, well, I suppose last week it was portrayed without spelling it out as almost being akin to rape.
Well, certainly the way it was presented, the way I'd seen it, I would certainly describe it as if it's not rape, certainly a form of sexual assault. And as a majority of travellers, and speaking even locally to members of the travel community in the area, I mean, it isn't something that exists. I mean, it's something that most travellers haven't heard of, didn't realise. And when you look at it, it's not.
Is there an equivalent? Is there something by a different name?
Well, no. I mean, I think it's something that has developed among particularly some young men and young travellers within certain groups and certain families, perhaps in Ireland and Britain. It isn't something that you would describe as part of traveller tradition or traveller culture. I would say it's something that's more to do with a youth culture than it has to do with a tradition or a practice among the broader travelling community. I mean, I've heard that it exists among some segments of settled society as well. It's something that has developed over the last 10 or 15 years. I don't know the mechanics of it. It apparently involves, as I say, grabbing a young woman and in a sense forcing yourself on him.
Which is not something I've heard of, if I can contradict you, in the settled society.
Well,
I'm sure there may be rare cases, but it usually ends up before the judiciary.
Again, it's how it's presented, and it seems to be that, as I would suggest, that something has developed as a youth culture phenomenon, as opposed to a traveller culture phenomenon, or any element of tradition among the traveller community. It's certainly not something that I have come across, or certainly that many travellers are shocked in some sense to discover its existence.
How do traveller men and women tend to meet then and start their courtship?
That's quite interesting, because I watched the programme and I found the programme quite ironic when in the first episode it highlighted this issue of this idea of grabbing and presented it as how young travellers meet their partners, and it showed a wedding of a young couple who. And the irony of what they were presenting was that the young couple had described how they'd met on Facebook. Now, so you go from one notion of how people would meet in its ultra sort of modernity, and then they present this as something traditional among the traveller community. So there was a major contradiction in what the programme itself was trying to present. There are among the traveller community a tradition of arranged and matched marriages. And that's something that is common and something that's probably known broadly, and that still continues to exist among many traveller families. How other traveller, how people meet, it would be akin to how the settled community meet. There are, people who meet in various ways. The notion that this is some sort of tradition or some sort of practice that all travellers engage in to find a partner is a complete and utter drivel. And as I said, there was this clear contradiction in the programme when they presented that particular matter in covering that, and then covering the wedding of the couple who themselves had met, as I said, on Facebook. So there was a clear contradiction in how it was being presented.
So in exposing the different elements it did in the way that it did the programme do a disservice to travellers, or has it raised awareness of some of the differences and at least sparked debate? Has it achieved something?
I think it has achieved something in that line. It has sparked debate, and it's sparked debate among the travelling community, and it has, I suppose, sparked a reaction from the settled community. And I think you make a fair point. I think it does show. The problem with it doesn't show diversity enough. It has picked on particular extremes and has highlighted those extremes. And in the form it takes, and it presents itself as a documentary, it presents those extremes as the norm for the traveller community. And that is the danger, essentially, with the programme, that it doesn't create a proper balance. It doesn't talk to, as I said, the people who may have difficulty with that type of presentation, that type of, shall we say, over-the-top celebration of weddings or christenings or other events. So it didn't achieve a balance in that respect, and that, to me, is my main concern with the actual programme, that it gets presented as a documentary, a factual type programme, presenting the lives of travellers. It doesn't present the lives of travellers. It presents the life of some travellers. And in many cases, what makes good television is that flamboyant, over-the-top, essentially sort of focus on dresses and the wedding celebrations. And that, unfortunately, is the difficulty I have with the programme.
David, Joyce, we'll leave it there. Thanks for taking our call today.